Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 5 Things You Didn't Know You Could Do with a Co-op. This webinar is brought to you by the ANA Nonprofit Federation in partnership with Data Axle. I'm Jeremy Latson, Manager of Education and Events for the ANANF and your host for today's session. The ANA and the Nonprofit Federation are proud to support informative events like today's webcast. For more information about the ANA Nonprofit Federation, visit ana.net/nonprofit. Before we begin, I'd like to start out with a few minor housekeeping items. We would like this to be an interactive experience, and we encourage you to participate by adding questions and comments. Please use the Q&A window to submit your questions to today's presenters. Your questions in this window will not be visible to other attendees. You will also see a chat function. Please use this window to report any issues you're having or to make comments on today's topic. You're welcome to submit questions at any time, and we will get to as many of them as possible. A PDF version of the presentation and the recording of this webinar will be available for viewing and posted on the ANA website within a few days. We value your feedback, and we ask that you please take a moment to fill out the webinar survey. I'll post a link to the survey in the chat, and the link will also be in the follow-up email that is sent when the recording is available. Lastly, the speaker's presentation and comments represent their own viewpoints and do not necessarily represent the views of the ANA or the ANA Nonprofit Federation. Again, today's presentation is 5 Things You Didn't Know You Could Do with a Co-op. Today, you will hear from Colin Anderson, GM Donor Cooperatives at Data Axle. With that, I'll turn it over to Colin. Hey, Colin, you're on mute.
Good start. Great, thanks, Jeremy. Very excited to be here. And thank you to everyone who's in attendance today and tuning in. We appreciate you joining, and I look forward to hopefully providing you with some actionable content around how to further leverage your organization's co-op relationship. So I appreciate that we all have a wide variety of backgrounds here as it relates to co-ops, but I believe there will be something here for everyone. At least that's my intention, to give you a peek into the ways in which you may not be aware that co-ops can leverage the rich data they possess to further your organization's mission. Sorry, having some issues. Did the slide change for everyone?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. So my name is Colin Anderson. I am the General Manager of Cooperative Databases at Data Axle. And I've worked in the co-op space for over 10 years, joining Data Axle about 8 months ago. So my background is originally on the tech and data science side of the house. So given a deep understanding of the processes and how the sausage is made, if you will, I hope to give you a unique perspective on some of the tools that I think are powerful and potentially even underutilized in the cooperative database space. So before we dive in and get too into the details, I'd like to give a little context and background on co-ops in general. So again, I'm sure that many of you are quite familiar with the cooperative database framework, understand well how they work. But I just want to be sure that we're all looking through the same lens. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes giving you my perspective and how I think about co-ops and why I think that they're quite powerful. And as Jeremy said, please feel free to ask any questions that you might have as we go. I find that the answers to be more relevant if I'm able to give them to you during the time that you think of them with that context. So no need to wait till the end, though if you'd prefer to wait, that's fine as well. Okay, so what is a co-op? Most people outside of our nonprofit donor fundraising world and bubble, likely are unfamiliar. You've probably experienced that, talking to friends and family. So again, I know we're familiar, but just want to give some quick background where a cooperative database is, I think, an incredibly powerful concept. that I myself even take for granted at times. But really, it's quite a novel and powerful concept. So in essence, many of the most impactful charities and nonprofits cooperate by providing their donors and transactions to a database company. And there are a handful of these in the space. Those donors are resolved across the hundreds or even thousands of organizations that co-op might work with to create, a comprehensive picture and understanding of virtually every relevant active donor in the United States. So, to give you an example on the identity resolution, right, we might, a co-op will have to make a decision as to whether, let's say, John Smith at 123 Main Street is likely the same John Smith at, 333 Birch, right? Maybe that's like his prior address. So those kinds of things have to take place to really, unlock, right, like what a co-op is really doing, which is aggregating this data across individuals in the US. And then to round out that profile of the donors, most co-ops will add additional data elements on top of what is contributed by you, as an organization. And so, for example, I would think of things like age, income, personal interests, maybe purchase behavior, and other attributes that we've found to be, predictive of future philanthropic activity. And then, every co-op is going to have their own secret sauce when it comes to both this supplemental data and their approach to that identity resolution that I described. So, those are some key building blocks on the data and identity side. And then from there, I want to quickly touch on how that data is actually like translated right into what many of you are likely familiar with. Again, depending upon your relationship with the co-op, but that's likely, audiences, right? And so by audiences, I mean, lists of donors deemed likely to donate or to be interested in your organization's cause. And, that's generally accomplished through predictive modeling. I'm sure you've heard the term. And so to help us think about, what that means, I'd like to just quickly walk through like a thought exercise. So let's imagine, that we want to intuitively choose the best donors for a fundraising campaign. We know that traditional recency, frequency, and monetary components are all useful. And so we might decide to, within the co-op data, to choose donors who have given, let's say, more than $10 to 5 or more charities in the past 12 months or a year, right? And so, this is perfectly logical, a good selection, but can it be better? And the answer is yes, right? It can be more targeted. So let's imagine we are fundraising for, completely making it up, like koala bears, right? And protecting their habitat. So there are likely many donors in our selection who aren't necessarily interested in koalas, even though they donate often. So you might say, well, of course, we could add another criteria that says they must have also donated from similar animal causes. But, you can see how this just continues, right? There's probably more sophistication and differentiation that we can add between prospective donors who can, help like fine tune this decision, right? And so this is where modeling really shines. Given the correct data to train on, which we'll touch on here in a bit, these models will come up with the optimal set of criteria, essentially, to choose the best donors to spend, your precious budgeting dollars and efforts on for acquisition, right? So in our koala example, maybe that translates into something like, 50 attributes that are weighted against one another. For example, like giving more than $20 to 5 or more organizations in the past 6 months, and giving 2 or more times to animal causes in the past 3 months, and maybe those donors are usually between the ages of 50 to 70 and have an annual income between 80 and 120,000, just making up attributes. And, today's models tend to use complicated algorithms, artificial intelligence. So what I just described wouldn't exactly be the correct interpretation. It's much more complex than that. But, I think that it paints the picture that it's hard to just target a single variable or attribute, right? So the model really allows us to unlock the power of all of the data that's available in the co-op and choose, the best resources available. Okay, so co-op primer aside, let's get into some what I think are interesting and valuable use cases that leverage this data and modeling. So when you think co-op, you probably think donor acquisition. That's certainly the most common application and certainly a very important one. And there are many other ways, though, in which organizations can leverage this data and modeling that we just discussed. And that's really, some of the pieces that I want to focus on today. So while these may not be things that you didn't know, my hope is that our conversation will spark some ideas, and maybe you can come away today with something to test. So I'm excited to dive into first, building more bespoke custom audiences and the levers that you can work with your co-op to pool to target the specific kind of donor that is right for your organization at this current time. Then to get into lapse modeling and reactivation, certainly not a new idea, but a co-op's involvement here can breathe a lot of life into lapsed and deeply lapsed donors. And I'm really excited to talk about those opportunities. Then we'll get into what we're calling donor upgrades. Here we'll discuss modeling and data which can help you upgrade existing donors. So whether that be to larger gifts, more frequent giving, and some other concepts that we'll look into in detail. And then we'll evaluate removing likely underperformers from your campaigns. So I think now more than maybe ever, we are all feeling the importance of targeting the best prospects in the face of rising costs. So I think that this will be a relevant topic. And then last but certainly not least, we'll discuss omnichannel campaigns and how co-ops can be a key partner as you expand your messaging and reach beyond purely direct mail. So I think it's fair to say that every organization has their own subtle differences with their key KPIs, and ROI thresholds, payback periods, that they're aiming to achieve. And those likely, change over time, depending upon, what is the focus of your organization at a given point. And so given the breadth and depth of data on every prospective donor that we discussed and, the ever evolving modeling techniques at the co-op's disposal, co-ops can be, highly specific and targeted more and more so over time in building these audiences. And so, we all know that co-ops build models specifically designed for your cause. So they are custom in that sense. But we're going to take that a step further by adding the specific type of donor within those broadly interested in your cause.
Hey, Colin, we have a question.
Sure.
The question is, can anyone use co-op data, or do you need to be a contributor in order to use the data for mailing?
Yeah, great question. So yeah, the power of the co-op is that it's a mutually beneficial relationship between these organizations. So you do need to contribute data in order to access this. And co-ops are very respectful to these arrangements and sure to not use this data outside of those who are contributing. Okay, so let's make the idea here around what I mean by this bespoke modeling, more targeted donor, like a little more concrete. So let's say that you're in a growth mode and really looking to build your file and bring on new donors. So in a situation like that, co-op should be training their models for you to prioritize responsiveness, right? That's the key, bringing donors onto file. So effectively, they might tell the model to treat all donors who responded to your past campaigns as equal, right? That's what the model wants to find more of. So don't give any priority or weight, to the ones that gave a larger gift. And I just paint this as an example of like the kind of thing a co-op would actually do, to implement this. So, this would of course be in contrast to a situation where, you're prioritizing the quality of the donor, maybe as measured by their initial gift to your organization in acquisition. And so here, for example, what a co-op might do if they had that information from you is they might tell the model to give extra importance or to weight those donors in relation to that gift amount. So, those that give a higher amount, the model knows that they're more important and then effectively will produce different results. So while this sounds like, subtle differences in what the model is being told, the types of decisions that it makes in the output are actually pretty large. So let's think back to all the data at a co-op's fingertips to imagine like why this is the case. So having a deep donation history, it gives a lot of predictive power to determine like who habitually is, let's say, like a tipper, but highly responsive, if you will, versus perhaps like a more selective donor who's going to give $100 on average if the cause is important to them. And I can say from, firsthand experience, looking at models, looking at the actual variables within those models, that those two types of donors look very different from one another in terms of the actual data elements that make those predictions. They have highly, like very different characteristics, even though they might both be interested in your cause. So I think like the takeaway here is that, the co-ops have this ability to tease apart these types of donors. And then we'll talk about, how to like effectively implement that together with the co-op. And then here, just want to highlight, I think an interesting tip that comes up often, or an interesting example as a tip. We've seen in exploring these relationships between specifically donors who give high initial gifts that they don't do so randomly. So they're highly likely to give high gifts again in the future, as opposed to reverting to something like a tipper or, coming onto file, giving you $100 and then later giving you $1 or $5. It's not very common in terms of like the correlation and the data that we see. So ultimately, this leads to that strong correlation between a donor's first gift with your organization and the lifetime value that can be expected to have, that they can be expected to have with your cause. And again, this is just meant to highlight an example that I've seen come up frequently. All right, so I'd like to briefly touch on, how to make this actionable. So I think it's quite simple, really. It's mostly a exercise in communication. The co-op will do the lifting. So it's fairly simple in that, basically let your co-op know the type of donor that you're after, right? So this can be as broad as saying, hey, we're looking to boost our file, bring donors onto file, let's prioritize response, or we're looking to be extra selective and only bring on those higher average gift donors. Or, we're looking to bring on donors who are more likely to give often, multiple times after the cause. I know I've really focused on the high gift and the responsiveness, but, there's certainly other variations, right? Like on the previous slide that you might want to target. Maybe it is that specifically LTV or multi-givers, or, there are those kinds of things that you can communicate, and the co-op can do the work to translate that back to the modeling. So any of these communications should be plenty for the co-op to work with and tailor the model for you. If you'd like, you can be even more specific and provide those key performance indicators or payback periods or ROI or whatever you're using to make your decisions about whether, a list is successful. Co-ops, their incentives are well aligned. They want to give you the donors that, you're after. And so they will be able to take that information and make those modifications, in their modeling. Now, I think an important point here is to consider like measuring the success. So in a perfect world, obviously it'd be great if there weren't trade-offs. We wouldn't need to have the discussion between what type of donor. Co-ops would simply increase response while all being $100+ donors. Unfortunately, that's just not the way that things shake out. Like I said, the attributes underlying these types of donors are quite different, often at odds with each other, even like inversely related in some sense, which is a bit counterintuitive given that they're both interested in your cause, but that is the nature of it. So in our example of response versus gift, there tend to be a lot more tippers in the world than there are the $100 givers. So it's critical to evaluate the performance of the more tailored model based upon whatever criteria it is that you've communicated and that you're trying to identify, right? So while a high gift audience might come in under campaign average, it should excel in the average gift category, right? And it might have a quicker payback with better ROI. So again, all depends upon your internal strategy. And just something that I think is worth pointing out, that even within the campaign, some lists might be optimized for something different from others. So now I'd like to talk about reactivating lapsed donors. And I know this is, not a foreign concept to probably anyone here and to any organization. Bringing donors onto file is only half the battle. Once they slip past being an active giver and haven't given in many months or even years, all organizations obviously do their best to cost effectively re-engage those donors. So certainly not putting that into question. In fact, I think though that in our current fundraising environment, with rising costs, lower response rates seen in many places, I think it might be even more important than ever to look at these lapsed donors, especially for those of you with larger lapse files. Obviously, as it becomes a higher percentage of the available prospect pool. So all else equal, it's no secret that lapsed donors respond at higher rates than pure prospects. So again, while these like paper and postage costs are up, it makes sense to use all the intelligence available, I think, to be sure that you're maximizing the gifts and responsiveness from these lapse files. And so I bring this up obviously in the lens of co-ops, right? And so I'm excited to give you this background on why I think co-ops can give you significant return on lapse efforts, and some pointers on how to find the best co-op or even multiple co-ops for your file, and some theories on why lapse is potentially underutilized in the co-op space. So the key point that I hope to convince you of is why a co-op can add, I think, a massive amount of value to a donor that you already have a relationship with. They're a donor that you can see all of their giving history in the org. So what's more predictive of like their future behavior than what you already know about them, right? And I think that's often the reason that it's not immediately clear why this cooperative databases can be helpful in lapse, because you do already have that relationship. But I think that the answer can be found in two parts that are pretty clear. And the first is that co-op modeling on existing donors becomes increasingly powerful as that donor ages, so the time from which they last gave to your organization. In terms of predictability and modeling, once a donor moves into what I've seen in the data, roughly 2 years or more since the last gift with your org, they start to look a lot like a new prospect in the eyes of a predictive model. And they're not wildly different from those that haven't given to you before in terms of, again, what is predictive of a future response. And the second part is that'll help us think about this, I think, is that co-ops have thousands of data points on most of these lapsed donors. So I would say that the average is 90% or more that a co-op can add intelligence to this lapsed donor file. It's, that's probably conservative. So while you may only know that, John Smith, going back to our example at 123 Main, gave you a $10 gift 37 months ago, a co-op might know, right, that John Smith started picking up his giving activity 6 months ago and has been very active and has given thousands of dollars in that time, for example, right? So almost surely he's worth reaching out to, but there'd be no way for you to know that, that's a good decision if the only pieces of information that you know is that John Smith had given you $10 37 months ago. You just don't have the information. So what are our options for implementing and using this intelligence that co-ops have on your lapsed donors? First and most straightforward is through modeling, right? So same framework in which you're used to working with co-ops for acquisition. By providing either lapse campaigns that you've run in the past, straight acquisition campaigns, or even just your donors themselves, co-ops can build models which will effectively rank your lapsed donors from most likely to least likely to respond, just like they do in ranking the cooperative database for acquisition. And leveraging exactly that same type of information that we described in our example with the John Smith. Or here's an even easier implementation. Through your existing acquisition campaigns with co-ops, simply don't suppress lapsed donors. Allow them to naturally come into top segments if the acquisition model deems them worthy. So of course, you might be thinking, that's great, but I'm already planning to mail some of those donors, myself. And I think that that's fine. You can either send your co-op a file of those lapsed donors that you plan to mail, and they can suppress before they provide you the new data and net them out, or you can net them out in the merge and have your co-op price that accordingly so that it makes sense. So in my opinion, based on what I see in modeling, how many of these lapsed names rank highly, what gets suppressed before they're shipped to the organization, and then what actually gets mailed. So, I can see those pieces in many cases, right? Like these lapsed donors ranked quite highly in models. We didn't provide them, but they also, didn't get mailed at some phase. And again, it's due to the data asymmetry. I think that there's huge opportunity here. I think that, many of these co-op qualified, let's say, lapsed donors are getting left on the table, and they're worthy of being reached out to. So it can be difficult to know as well, beyond just the audience, like where exactly to draw the line and set the budget for lapse campaigns. And I have the opinion that co-ops can indirectly help here as well. So it might be hard to know where the break-even line is for your, making it up, but 36 to 48 month lapsed donors. Do you set that frequency based upon, the fact that they've given 2 or more gifts with you and, a lifetime amount of whatever, $50, just making it up? It's hard to know. I mean, of course, testing can help refine that. But how much larger could that campaign be with solid ROI? If you knew more. So not only can a co-op tell you, who of your lapsed donors you should promote, but they can help you set where that line is. And by leveraging these model tiers, it's simple to test into the appropriate depth for your required ROI, and be confident, again, that you aren't leaving some of those high quality, lapsed donors on the table. And then, just quickly here, I think while leaving the co-ops to focus on your lapse segmentation strategy, this can free up resources, right, to focus on what matters most, personalizing the message to your cause, and getting that out in the best way. Sorry about that. I did want to make one additional point here that I almost overlooked, but I think it's an important one. So I'd like to talk about how to determine, which co-op will give you the best performance on your lapse donors. And even talking a little bit about the perception of using one or more co-ops and where I think the industry is today, and in my opinion, like where it should go. So there are a few options in making this determination, right? So first, if we think back to qualifying, lapsed donors by not suppressing them in acquisition, you're going to want to be sure that all your acquisition co-op partners are using the same suppression strategy, and let the donors flow in. You don't want one co-op suppressing all of your donors and then another, only suppressing some smaller range, right? That's one consideration. Or, if you're having a co-op directly score your full lapsed file, which, gives it a lot of flexibility, more so than the acquisition example. Obviously you can test those head to head. I think that's quite clear. Take the top X number from each equally and just let the market determine the victor, which is providing you the best performance. But I don't think that, you necessarily need to stop there. Once the lead co-op for those lapse selections has been tapped out, and can't find, additional lapse donors that are of high quality to meet your performance metrics, I think it's viable to send everything else to a second co-op to rank what's remaining, right? So remember, like all co-ops have different data, identity resolution, and modeling and contributors. So they're all going to have different views of your lapse file, just as they do for acquisition. So they will find more good lapse donors that you were about to pass up. And I've seen this work time and time again, and it's quite low risk, right? So if you don't find more lapse donors that meet your criteria, it's easy and simple to learn that through testing. And then, I just think like philosophically, it's the same as on the acquisition side. I think we're all quite familiar with leveraging co-ops, multiple co-ops for acquisition. It's somewhat rare, I would say, in my experience, to rely on a single co-op source for all acquisition needs. And I think really there's no difference in terms of, lapse modeling, right? If we, I've made the assertion that a deeply lapsed name from a modeling perspective is quite similar to a pure prospect. So if that's the case, the same logic should apply, right? That there's, especially for larger lapse files, there's likely good opportunity to be had to use more than one. So beyond lapse modeling, co-ops can help with what we're calling here donor upgrades, or upgrading donors on your entire donor file. So again, co-ops can use their extensive donor demographic interest, and in this case, often wealth and income data to help you make informed decisions for outreach. So I think that this is especially helpful for some of the examples we're about to go through, because many of these require, as you well know, more personalized and therefore likely, expensive outreach. So targeting is particularly important. So I'll move on to examples to make this a little more clear as to what I'm talking about here. So while not meant to be an exhaustive list, here are some common types of giving that we see requested, and have found success helping many organizations, achieve finding these types of donors on their files. So again, like when I say upgrade, I mean it generally, in that it could specifically mean things like, finding sustainers, donors who are likely to give to you frequently and often and consistently, even if they aren't contacted regularly. And this type of donor is obviously, fantastic for an organization. Finding donor advised funds, which is a charitable investment account where an individual or entity, they contribute money that's allowed to grow tax-free. And they generally do this or have incentive to do this, right, because they get an immediate tax deduction, and then can make donations, out of that fund to charities over time. So it's already earmarked, for donation. And these have gained a lot of popularity in the US over the past few years. So I think that it is worth pointing out specifically. And then we have, finding major gift givers, which, is simply those donors on your file with the capacity and the wealth attributes, making them likely to give, a large gift to your organization. And obviously, many organizations choose to contact those with the capacity to give a major gift in a more personalized way. So maybe that's over the phone, a customized message, or some form of, in-person outreach. And so I bring that up just to say that, obviously these methods are expensive and reserved for only a few. And therefore, leaning on co-ops to help you really target and refine who that group of individuals that you might want to contact should be, is key and clearly important. And then finally, co-ops can help aid in finding donors likely to consider your charity as part of their estate planning in some form. So, often referred to as planned giving or deferred giving, essentially a gift that is earmarked for a future date. So it could be in a will. Again, these types of gifts, like major gift giving, often require that outreach and counsel. So I know, many of you are likely familiar with these gift types, but again, putting a little spin on it as to how you might leverage your co-op to either grow efforts in these types of upgrades where you might not have that type of donor today, or expand where you already do. So now that we have some examples of donor upgrades in mind, let's again, in the spirit of making it actionable, dive into the how you might execute this with your co-op. So first, this can be accomplished through custom modeling. If your organization has sustainers, donor advised funds, often referred to as DAFs for short, major gift givers, or plan givers already on your file, you can of course provide those to co-ops solely for modeling purposes. So they can, construct a model and identify the attributes of those types of donors and apply it to the rest of your file to say, you have more donors that look like they are likely to give you a high gift and are worth contacting. And I say solely for modeling intentionally, to mean that I understand that these premium types of donors are quite high value to your organization, and they can specifically be used for modeling only purposes at co-ops. So they don't necessarily have to be a part of the base. You can send these for training models and be confident that, if you arrange that with the co-op, that, they'll honor that. And then, from here, the obvious shortcoming with this approach, I think, is twofold. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's just potentially not possible in some situations. So one, you either may not yet have donors in these categories and you want to build that type of donor on your file. Obviously, if that's the case, there's nothing to provide to build this custom model. Or what happens quite often is there's just not sufficient size to build these types of predictive models, right? So, by definition, these are premium and low, low numbers typically that fall into these categories for most organizations. And so, what do we do in those cases? So I think that brings us to the second option here around data append. And I think that this, is a great path and working with your co-op to identify, which of these attributes are going to be beneficial to find these types of donors is like a great avenue to take. So, you can ask your co-op if they have data attributes such as, wealth indicators, or even better, and I think this is where the space is headed, prepackaged sets of data or even scores, tailored to your desired type of donor upgrade, already ready to go. Like I said, we've identified these as commonly requested. So, those attributes I think are well understood by many co-ops and can be helpful in providing them. So for example, like if you're ready to cultivate some major gift givers, let your co-op know and have them append that relevant data to your file. Then you can make smart selections, combining this data with your active donor activity to significantly boost that performance. So, it's clear to see how that's the case, right? Like how critical would it be to know that someone has the actual financial wealth, income that's active on your file to give a major gift. And to me, like the appeal here for organizations is, ease of use and can be quite cost effective. So, okay, I'd like to make this a little more real with a specific example. So Data Axle recently worked with a large nonprofit organization that was interested in the growing donor advice fund space that I mentioned, and wanted help identifying them on their file. So armed with that knowledge, the organization's team could effectively reach out and prioritize building those relationships with the donors and ultimately, received gifts from those funds, ideally. So it fits very nicely into, what we just discussed. So in this case, Data Axle worked closely with the organization to analyze their high value donors, and using a suite of wealth attributes, identified a set of donors likely to have these donor advised funds. And so what was the result? The interesting part. The organization then went on and contacted the likely donors with donor advised funds and experienced some, I think, pretty incredible results. So they brought on 35 donors that had donor advised funds. And the impressive piece, in my opinion, is that they did this while receiving 3 times the donation revenue of the cost to run the campaign. So in other words, they were able to identify these funds at a profit, which, it's hard to bring any type of new donor onto file at a profit, obviously. And they were able to match back over $40,000 from the pieces mailed directly to donor advised funds on the back end. Okay, so shifting gears here a bit, I'd like to talk about what's, I think at this point, the elephant in the room when it comes to fundraising. And it's that fundraising is hard right now. So I think everyone is experiencing this to some degree, not telling you something that, you don't know. But obviously mail and postage costs are up, while response rates, are often down relative to the past few years across the board. Probably due to a weakening economy and some macro headwinds. And so, certainly a tough combination for fundraising for any organization. So I just paint that backdrop to say, I think it's especially prudent to talk about, ways to save money in our campaigns on those unlikely to respond. And co-ops are well suited to provide help here. So usually, when you think about a model, the idea is that it's used to find the best of something, the best donors, the highest givers, etc. But a model can just as easily be flipped on its head and used to find the worst of something. It's equally good at both, actually. So, that would be the donors least likely to respond or the donors likely to give the lowest gift. So, the co-ops will have different product names for this. Most have some form of this product, but in practice, you'd ask your co-op to build you a model with the purpose of finding and suppressing, the weakest prospective donors, and then apply that to your campaign right before, you put that in the mail. So, once identified, you can simply suppress them, save budget, you could replace them with better prospects from a co-op, or, and what you'd likely do first to reduce the risk, right, is just key them out and observe, are those donors truly weaker performance like the co-op suggested? And obviously this is like particularly applicable in direct mail, where the cost per donor to contact is quite high. So, any donor that you can say with relative certainty that they're unlikely to give a gift, it's obviously a slam dunk to save that cost, not send them the paper, not pay the postage. And the cost for the suppression model from the co-op, is quite tiny in comparison. So it makes it clearly a good, risk to reward strategy. And another, application could be to contact the weaker performance with a cheaper package, or even a cheaper acquisition channel. So that brings us nicely to the final section, where I want to talk about omnichannel campaigns. I think co-ops are, often thought of as direct mail partners, but I want to show that the same set of tools, including rich data, again, identity resolution, modeling, it's all well suited for other emerging channels that you may already have experience with, or maybe not. Either is fine. And I do know that omnichannel is a bit of a buzzword, but I think that it's quite clear from results that we've seen and conversations, we've had with organizations that, these new digital channels used thoughtfully with direct mail, I think are the future of nonprofit fundraising. Direct mail is always key and critical, but used in combination, these can be pretty powerful channels. So, I think when I think back to, kind of when first started hearing conversations, about digital advertising and organizations, it was really as simple as categories like, are we fundraising, offline or online, right? Very broad. And, I think what we've seen, over the past decade, 5 years, especially the last few, is technology advancements have given us, this ever evolving set of contact channels to get your organization's mission in front of the right audience. So these would be things like, targeted mobile ads, connected TV, social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, email outreach, and web display. Just as a handful, but it's really evolved to these personalized digital channels. So we've discussed the tools which allow co-ops to build these top tier audiences, but those tools apply regardless of channel. So co-ops are always collecting, more channel specific data, and it's really on pace with the way in which the industry is evolving with using those channels, because, once they're used and captured, they're contributed to the co-ops. So we're really building that infrastructure in parallel as the efforts, as organizations expand their efforts in those channels. And by having that data, then models can be built not only to predict the likelihood to respond at all, but also the likelihood to respond, specifically by channel. So you can imagine, right, that the attributes of a donor likely to mail in a check, let's say, in response to a postcard, they might be and often are quite different from a donor who may want to contribute through their Facebook feed, let's say. So, assuming a highly customized audience targeting your mission and preferred channel, you then need to find them, right? If we say, this, again, back to our John Smith example, John Smith at 123 Main, he's a great candidate for Facebook outreach. If we can't find John Smith on Facebook, we're dead in the water. That information is not helpful for us, right? So just like in direct mail, where co-ops provide a physical postal address, for you to identify where that donor is in their mailbox. Co-ops have established the necessary data and partners to find donors in these digital channels. That's often things like email, and then, key relationships to link that email to the right channel. So I think that the key point there is that, once the audience can identify it, you want to know with high certainty that that message gets in front of, the correct person, and that, a co-op really does both of those components, making it, quite seamless. So now I'd like to jump into an example. Defenders of Wildlife has generously allowed us to share the results of a digital campaign that they executed in partnership with DataAxle. And I like this example because it shows, again, like the range of services that many co-ops can provide when it comes to digital campaigns. Defenders of Wildlife was looking for a partner to help with both targeting and strategic targeting of the audience, and then the execution, of that campaign. DataAxle and Defenders of Wildlife determined that a co-targeting campaign combining normal direct mail was appropriate. So specifically using connected TV and a retargeting display advertising campaign with similar creative across and messaging was the chosen execution plan. And if you aren't familiar with connected TV, I think it's an interesting and reasonably new channel. Surely, many of you are familiar, but to give a bit of background, historically, TV advertisement more generally was costly and more importantly, very difficult to attribute, right? If you run a commercial on a major network, it's, there are some measurement tools, but it's quite difficult, right, to be able to effectively attribute donations to that often hefty spend. And so with the emergence of personalized streaming devices like, Amazon TV, I think Roku, it's possible to now be individually selective about who you put an ad in front of in their television set, right? So you can see how this really opens up TV as a viable possibility. So again, to recap, we've got a direct mail campaign with connected TV and display retargeting, all with unified branding and messaging running in parallel. So what did we observe? The interesting piece. We observed a 300% increase in engagement with the banner ads as compared to industry averages using those ads. And this is likely due to the true omnichannel nature of the campaign. So Defenders of Wildlife was obviously top of mind with these donors, and that's what manifested in this 3x increase. We saw a 12% lift in revenue across the entire campaign compared to normal, and that was attributed directly to connected TV. And here are some I think, very impressive stats. Using test and control of those donors given all channels of communication, so all three, a 60% increase in responsiveness as compared to those who only received a piece in the mail. And not only was responsiveness up, but those donors who were exposed to all channels tended to give 16% more than those who were only given a mail piece. So hopefully these stats, pique your interest to the power of, what I think was a very well executed omnichannel effort. And you can really lean on your co-op. Just want to stress that again, to help with the omnichannel campaign beyond purely just providing that, that audience, which I think is often what co-ops are thought of doing.
Hey, Colin, we're coming up on time, but I wanted to make sure we had time for some questions.
Yep. Yeah, I think we are just on the last slide here, so should be great.
Okay.
So, I know we've covered many topics, so just quickly to recap, hopefully, spark some ideas in new areas or areas that, you're already familiar with. But, whether that be, strategically pulling those modeling levers to find the exact type of donor, that you're interested in, using the co-op data to really juice your lapsed donor campaigns, potentially using multiple co-ops to do so. Those donor upgrades that we talked about, getting the data or modeling from a co-op to launch some of those efforts, removing those underperformers. And, in today's age, I think that's an interesting one that should certainly at least be tested. And then, as we just touched on, these omnichannel campaigns. And then I do just want to quickly plug a webinar that Data Axle is hosting coming up here November 2nd. It's in the same vein of the omnichannel approach that we just discussed, but we'll go much deeper. And Data Axle's Richard Geiger and Bonterra's Kimberly O'Donnell will be hosting that. So if you can make it, love to see you there. And with that, I'll kick it over to you, Jeremy. So thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Colin. I just have one quick announcement before we get to the questions. Our next webinar is November 16th. It's called It's Time to Challenge the Status Quo, 2023 Innovations in Fundraising. In this must-attend webinar, we will be discussing 2022 data trends while looking forward to 2023. Our experts will explore new ideas worth testing in 2023 and delve into data in the clickless world, challenges in paper and production, digital and social trends, and much more. Join us on November 16th, and I've placed the link in the chat. There's still time to get questions in, and I'll get to the ones that we have already right now. Let's see. Are all co-ops blind, meaning that you don't know what organizations are submitting their donor information? Are there any co-ops that are known for having more center/left-leaning donors organizations?
Right. So co-ops are, as a default, blind. So they're not going to inform organizations, specifically which have joined. So in the cases of, the case study with Defenders of Wildlife, some organizations, agree to basically acknowledge that they're, part of co-ops, and that's perfectly fine. With most, many large organizations in the US using co-ops, I think that it's, common knowledge that, they're going to be in many of these. And then in terms of the second question, certainly. So the mix of contributors to co-ops does vary, right? So there will be certain co-ops that tend to be on the political side, have more left-leaning contributors versus right-leaning. Some have both. It really varies. But generally, they'll kind of let like broadly speaking, which it is without divulging the actual organizations. They can give you that kind of information.
Great. This one is, I've never worked with a co-op before. What's needed?
Yeah. So generally, to kick off the relationship with the co-op, you have to provide, again, some amount of data, in order to participate. And so, you would, work with, either your broker or your co-op to just, look through what kinds of elements that you would need to provide in order to participate. And then, it's quite simple from there. Then it's really just giving the co-op the types of things that you're interested in, and they handle the heavy lifting and, send back, whichever of these pieces is going to be useful for you, often audiences for acquisition.
All right, I think we have time for one more. Are there advantages to using more than one co-op?
Yeah, so I think, as I touched on a bit on the lapsed side, it's very common that multiple co-ops are used for acquisition, and I think the same holds up for lapsed. And it's for the reasons that, co-ops do all of these things slightly differently, and so they all have their own methods of finding these donors for your organizations. And those things in combination yield different results. And so it makes a lot of sense to use multiple and reduce risk. Having a single supplier of acquisition for your organization often referred to as all your eggs in one basket, or things of that nature, can put you at risk.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening and participating in today's webinar. And thanks again to our speaker for taking the time to share their expertise and answer your questions. We will share a link to the recording and the presentation, which you should receive within, I would say, about the next week. Your feedback is important, so please take a moment to fill out the survey. Again, that link is in the chat. And this concludes our webinar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.